Hello friends, and welcome back to another Saturday with Coriander Quilts. I've got another fun video for us today. At least I think it's going to be a lot of fun. We have viewer questions. I've got more than one today that I'm going to be talking about. Viewer comment of the video, which I think this one is so much fun. We have the new $5 pattern of the month for November, and I'm going to be walking you through a tutorial for that block so that if you purchase that $5 pattern, you're going to be all set on the piecing. And then the last thing I'm going to be sharing in today's video is that little cupcake paper quilt that you guys chose the border fabric for. So you'll have to stick around and see what ended up being the popular vote, and let's get started. Our first question comes to us from Christine Pear, 3181. She says, when joining two rows of pieced blocks and butting/nesting the pieced seams, some stay nicely butted and some do not, ending up with a small gap. Can you help me know what I'm doing wrong, and does it have something to do with the feed dogs? I am a pinner and it still happens. So there are probably a couple different reasons that this could be happening. Pinning is always great to keep those seams in place. If you are pinning on just one side of the seam, you might consider pinning on both sides of the seam. This helps secure both ends. So if it's coming apart this way or this way, if that makes sense, you've got both of those seams kind of covered on both sides. There are also pins that are one pin, but it has two prongs. So it goes, they're made specifically for pinning on both sides of a seam. So that might be something that you like using. I tried those out and found that they weren't for me, but I'm also not a pinner. That might be something that works well for you and something to be aware of that it exists. The other thing that I wanted to mention, which might be an even bigger help, is paying attention to the direction that your top seam is going when you're sewing. And I want to show you an example of what I'm talking about. Okay, so I was making these 4-patch blocks yesterday, and you know, we want that intersection there to be nice and tidy. Now, I often like sewing with this seam. So if I'm sewing on this side, I like if this seam is going down because it just runs through your machine nice and flat, and you never have to worry about this little guy flipping up. However, your seams butt nicer and stay in place better if you sew them this direction. You don't always have the option which direction this seam is going to lie when you are sewing, but one thing to keep in mind is if this seam is going up and you're sewing like this seam butts nice and tight right against the other side and is less likely to move out of position than if you were sewing it with that top seam facing down. Now, the one thing that you really need to pay attention to when you sew seams this way is that this one will sometimes want to get caught under your sewing machine foot. So that's not as nice when sewing this way, but the way your seams butt up against, it just really locks it into place. So that is an advantage to having your top seam going that direction when you're sewing. Something to keep in mind, and you might just experiment a little bit with it and see, oh, I really like this, or this is not for me. That top seam going against my sewing machine foot when I sew up is not ideal. But wanted to mention that because that might be a helpful technique for you. If anyone else has other suggestions for reasons our seams might come apart, there are, you know, any number of reasons. Some of them could be sewing machine related. You know, maybe your feed dogs are tugging a little more aggressively than your top is feeding through. There would be like walking feet, or some sewing machines have even feed on the top and the bottom that feed things through nice and evenly. So something like that could be a consideration. I know there are people who do all of their piecing using a walking foot so that they get a nice even feed. So if some of the, you know, troubleshooting techniques don't work for you, it might be worth considering, you know, maybe this is a sewing machine issue. Maybe I need to look at something a little bit different in regard to what I'm currently using to piece my blocks. So, and chime in if some of you have other suggestions for things that have worked for you. Chime in the comments. The more information we have, the more we can find out what works best for us. The next question comes to us from YTHB4WH, and she says, or he, I'm not sure, I don't know of any square beds. Why are the finished size of so many quilt patterns square? There are a number of different reasons that I thought of off the top of my head for why this would be. The first one, not all quilts are made for beds. So sometimes you're looking for a small baby quilt, or maybe you want a throw quilt, something you're going to have on your couch, or you're taking along, if you're a cold weather person, sometimes you want that quilt to take along with you in your vehicle so that if you ever happen to get stranded somewhere, or if you're going to a sporting event, you've got that quilt that you can grab out of the back of your vehicle to keep you warm. And those you might not mind if it's rectangle or square, but maybe you don't want something big like you would want for a bed. And then two other reasons that could be an answer. If a quilt pattern is designed for a pre-cut, a specific pre-cut, it's made for jelly rolls or layer cakes, then we are often limited to the size of the project because the fabric that we have is already predetermined. We are trying to figure out the best way to utilize that jelly roll quilt or to utilize that layer cake or whatever size pre-cut that is. And that can sometimes, it limits us in the sizes that we can do a quilt pattern in. And then the last thing is that some quilts just look better square than rectangular. And I did up an example for you guys that covers both of those last two options, a pre-cut quilt that looks better square. And I'm just gonna talk about that a little bit. This quilt is my Jelly Roll Jackpot quilt. I designed it for Callie & Co. I'll link to the trunk show where I showed this quilt in more detail, as well as all of the new Callie & Co. quilt patterns. And this is a Jelly Roll quilt, and it's a square quilt. And I'm going to show you this a little bit better on this printout that I've done here and show you what I'm talking about. This is the full layout of this quilt. It's a square quilt. It utilizes a jelly roll really well. And as you can see in all of these four corners, it's very symmetrical. It all matches up and is very symmetrical. Now, if we turn this into a rectangular quilt, what happens here is we have the star points coming out just on the one side of the quilt. And then we have this other side without the star points here. And it doesn't repeat as nicely across the quilt horizontally and vertically as the square version does. And you can just see that this quilt is more pleasing to the eye than this quilt is. And this quilt uses the jelly roll more efficiently than this one does. So that's kind of a visual reason of why a quilt might work better square as opposed to rectangular. Now you can always, if you prefer rectangular quilts as opposed to square quilts, maybe you found the perfect quilt but it's square, you can always alter that to fit your preferences. You know, simply dropping blocks in rows is one way to change the size, but you can also change the size by adding borders, and you would just do narrower side borders and bigger top and bottom borders to make a quilt rectangular. And that might sound strange, and you might think, oh, you'll notice that those borders are a much different size, but you'd be surprised how much you don't necessarily notice that borders are a different size. The quilt that I'm going to be sharing at the end of this video was rectangular to start with, but the rectangular dimensions weren't quite rectangular enough for me. And so for that quilt, I adjusted the borders when I added them, going narrower on the sides and bigger on the top and bottom. And once it's all quilted up, you're not really going to notice that those border dimensions are different. So that would be one way that you could change square to rectangular. All right, let me see what we've got next. One final question, and then we've got the viewer comments. So the last question, you have so many of your beautiful pre-cuts behind you. So, oh, and this comes from Joy Dixon Quilts. I didn't mention her name, Joy Dixon Quilts. So she's referencing these pre-cuts I have up here, fat quarter bundles. I have some jelly rolls over here. I've noticed many designers have them. Do they ever get used, or do you keep them as a record of your fabric lines? I'd be itching to break into them. Everyone's going to be different. For me, I keep one fat quarter bundle from all of my fabric lines so that I have that. I don't keep yardage of everything, so I'll have yardage, and once it runs out, I no longer have it. But I do like to keep one fat quarter bundle of all of my lines. So I have some of them down here, and I have some of them upstairs in my sewing room, and I just continue to keep them every time I have a new line come out. And usually, once I have a line come out, I have made anywhere from 5 to 8 quilts from that fabric line because I need to have quilt samples for all of my new quilt patterns. So it's not that hard for me to tuck that fat quarter bundle away because I've already made quite a few quilts using that fabric line. All right, now viewer comment before I move into that. If any of you have questions that you would like to have answered in an upcoming video, go ahead and leave those in the description box below. We're just going to keep updating our viewer question file, and I'll be pulling from those for the Saturday videos. Same goes for the viewer comments. If I see something that you guys have commented about that catches my fancy, like last week with Jenny's question, Jenny's comment, I will highlight it because you guys leave such great comments. So this one comes from Sue James, 3793, and this was a couple weeks ago. She says, very useful information today, many thanks. I have begun making scrap quilts, potato chip quilts, and such. If you're unfamiliar with potato chip quilts, those typically would be ones that use really tiny bits of fabric, and we're just using up all of those awesome fabrics that we have at the bottom of our scrap bin. It's a fun technique where you can just scrap away and really make use of those scraps. Look that up on YouTube if you're curious about that. Potato chip quilts. When I am tired but want to sew, I make a block. Crazy as it sounds, I use the same method for the quilt backs. These can be charity quilts, or I have found that many people love the look of these small pieces. I thought this was such a neat idea. I haven't ever seen a quilt back made doing it this way. Quilt fronts for sure, but not necessarily quilt backs, and that just sounds beautiful. Now, I hate piecing quilt backings, so this idea, as much as I think, oh, that would be amazing and I would want to do that, is not one that I would probably do. Only because I just don't want to do all of that piecing on the back. Not because it's not a fantastic idea. I think that would be amazing. And then you'd not only have your beautiful front of your quilt with everything pieced and your blocks, but then you'd have this wonderful scrappy back that might use some of the fabrics from the front, might use fabrics from many other projects, just in this beautiful scrappy deliciousness for your quilt back. And I think it's a fantastic idea. So that wasn't something I had ever considered. You know me, I don't like piecing my backing, so I'm 108s all the way, or as little piecing as possible. But for those of you who love making those beautiful quilt backings, I think this is a fantastic idea. So I wanted to highlight that. All right, we are now going to move into the $5 pattern of the month. Let me move some of my stuff out of the way here. We'll move $5 quilt on in. We will move Jelly Roll Jackpot on out. And let's talk about Star Twist. So Star Twist is our $5 pattern for the month of November. Can't believe we're at November again. I will link to the trunk show where I showed all of my beautiful day quilts. This was one of my beautiful day quilt patterns, so I'll link to the trunk show if you want to see this guy in more detail, or any of the other beautiful day quilts. But here is Star Twist. Now, one thing to note, as I'm showing this, you might be noticing this is a square quilt. However, it was not supposed to be a square quilt. And if you want some reassurance that even those of us that make hundreds of quilts, mistakes happen, here's your reassurance. This quilt, when I got it back from my quilter, so it should have been 4 blocks across by 5 blocks down. I got it back from the quilter and it needed trimmed up before I could bind it. So it still had all of the backing and batting. So I plonked it on my cutting table and immediately proceeded to cut. I'm trying to remember how I cut it. What I'm trying to say is I didn't cut the excess. I cut a portion of the quilt. I think it was probably along this seam right here, but on the row above. Cut it right off. And there was really no way to fix it. So what I ended up doing was cutting that whole row off. So I cut off this portion and this portion. So what was the sashing now became the outer border. So it worked out because there is the sashing and the border were the same size that I could do that. But that means it is one row shorter than what I had pieced. I'm glad there was an easy fix. But wow, when I cut that and then realized, oh my goodness, I just cut off a chunk of the border, it was a little bit shocking. So there's your reassurance that these things happen and happen to us even after we've been quilting and sewing many, many quilts. All right, let me talk a bit about this pattern. So this is Star Twist. It is a fat quarter friendly quilt. So 20 fat quarters, and then you're going to need some white fabric for your blocks. This is the white on white line from Beautiful Day, but Bella Solid in the color 9900-200 would have also been a great match. And then you need 2 yards of sashing, and then your binding and your backing. So it's a fun one to collect fabrics for, as it's a fat quarter quilt. Finishes at 63 by 78, and this month it is available for $5 over in my Etsy shop. I have it in both paper and PDF format, and I will have that information linked down below. Also, over on my blog, I will have new recolorings of Star Twist so that you can see what it would look like in some fabric lines that are currently in quilt shops. I think that's always fun to do up those digital renderings so that you can see what it would look like in those different lines. I know I want to do a fall line because I think that would be so pretty, but I do think it lends itself really well to be a holiday Christmas themed quilt because this just looks like peppermints to me. And I think that's so pretty, but it's going to look beautiful in a lot of different fabric lines. These somewhat larger outer spots here framing the stars can work for larger scale fabrics as well. I don't know that I'd go super big, but you can see that it works pretty nicely for some of those bigger prints. And that gives you an idea of what this quilt looks like. Now, the fun thing that I'm going to do here is I'm going to now do a block tutorial for one of the blocks in the quilt. This is one that I think you look at and might be a bit intimidated to think about piecing one of these blocks. So I wanted to show you how simple it actually is to piece one of these. It goes together pretty fast, and the techniques that we're using are stitch and flip and half square triangles, which are techniques that most quilters are very familiar with. If you have finished sewing the Cuddle Up sampler, you are stitch and flipped and half square triangle proficient by now. So we just finished that up this past Wednesday, and we got a lot of practice on those units. So let me go ahead and clear this away, get my pieces set out, and share that tutorial with you. I have all of my pieces laid out here and cut to make one block. Now you can easily see the pieces that you need for one block in the block diagram on page 1 in your Star Twist pattern. And I'm just going to walk us through. So for each block, you're going to need a few pieces of print 1, which is your center print. That is shown over here in green. And then you need a few pieces of print 2, which is your outer print. So that's going to be the red fabric that is in the illustration here. You're also going to need some background fabrics, which you see listed. So you're going to grab the pieces of print 1 and print 2, which I have. And then we are going to begin by constructing half square triangles. You're going to notice that we have a little bit of overlap in the same sized pieces. So we have A, B, and C from print 1, and then we also have C from print 2. So just be aware of that as you are grabbing your pieces. You're going to draw a diagonal line across the back of one white E-square, which I have already done, drawn my diagonal line. FYI, these prints are all from Callie & Co. And this white on white print that I'm using is from Coriander Seeds. It's the white print that is the same as this print right here. And so we've drawn our diagonal line on the back of E. We're going to pair that with our A square, with one A square. These get placed right sides together. Looks like I need to double check my measurement there on one of my pieces. If this ever happens to you and you're like, and you notice something is off. See, do you see my bottom piece there? So I have either miscut my white or I have miscut my bottom piece. So before I sew this, I'm gonna double check and see where my cutting went wrong. Sometimes this happens and then we just need to make an adjustment, but one of these pieces is not right. So I'm gonna double check that. I will also double check this piece and this piece because these would have been cut the same. So I'll double check that, but let's pretend my two pieces line up exactly right, and I'm not it's a little over 1/8 of an inch off. Pretend those line up perfectly, and what you're going to be doing then is you're going to be sewing 1/4 inch away from your marked diagonal on both sides. You see that illustrated here in step number 1. You're going to sew 1/4 inch away from that marked diagonal on both sides of the line, and then you cut apart on the diagonal, and then you're going to press your seams toward the print. You're going to make 4 of those, and you're going to trim those to the size listed in step 1. Your pattern will include the trim size that I have marked out here on my pattern. So I'm going to go double check which of my pieces isn't right. I'm guessing my white, just from looking at this, I'm guessing my white is not square because that looks square and that does not. So I think I need to cut 2 new white pieces. It's going to be my guess. I'll let you know what I find out, and I will get these half square triangles made. I'm going to need 4 of these half square triangles. It was the blueprint fabric that was being a little squirrely for me. He was just a little too long, so I had to give him a little bit of a haircut, and then away we went. So I guess I'm giving you a lot of encouragement in this video that yes, sometimes we make mistakes and we just fix them and we move on, and it all works out just fine. So that was an easy one to fix. Got those trimmed up. I have my half square triangles made. They are all trimmed down to size, and now we're ready to move on to step 2, and that is to make the pinwheel portion of our star block. So we are just sewing our half square triangles together, press as shown, and then complete it by sewing the last sewn rows together. I'm going to do that, but I'm also going to go ahead and talk about the next steps. I like to do as much at my sewing machine in one time as possible. So we're going to go ahead and get the next pieces. And starting here in step 3, we draw a diagonal line across the back of print 1 C-square. Now you remember print 1 is the green parts. So that would be this right here, and I have a diagonal line already drawn on the back of that C-square, and then we are going to be pairing that with an F rectangle. We're going to be doing stitch and flip corners on both sides of this F rectangle. So we have the wording here, and then the illustration is actually on the top of the next page. So we're going to be placing C on the left side of our F rectangle, and you do want to make sure, first of all, that you're choosing the right print, and second of all, that you are orienting your marked diagonal exactly as shown. We have 2 different versions of these stitch and flip rectangles. We have this kind right here, and then we have this kind right here. And the diagonals, as you can see, are going in opposite directions, and that's important to take note and make sure that you do them exactly as the pattern shows. So we're going to begin up here at the top of the page. C is placed on F. I'm going to sew on the marked diagonal, and then I'm going to press this away. Check to make sure that all of my perimeter edges are aligned. I don't want anything overhanging on the front side or the back side. And I always press before I trim so that I can double check that. Once I've made sure that everything aligns nicely on all edges, then I trim out my bottom 2 layers. The final step that you're going to do is then to go back in and press that seam open. Now, some of you may be wondering, why didn't we just skip the pressing to begin with? Just trim and then press open and call it a day. And the reason I don't do it that way is because I don't have any way of double checking to make sure I've sewn accurately if I trim those bottom layers away first. When we do stitch and flip units, we want our unit to measure the same as our bottom piece after we've sewn everything together. And it's so easy if you press first to be able to see, I'm going to exaggerate this, but to be able to see, oh my goodness, my piece doesn't go all the way to the outside edge. I must have done something wrong. It's oftentimes not as big of a mistake as that, but it's very easy to get off just a little bit on these stitch and flip units. And if we press first, we can always check to make sure that everything still lines up exactly perfect before we trim out those bottom layers. So that's why I do it that way. In this case, we do have to go back in and press open because of the way this block is pieced together. It's going to lay nicest if we press that seam open. So I do that as my last step. After I've completed this first corner, then we can go ahead and add the second corner. It's another C-square. This time it is the outer color, the color shown in red. We're going to do the same thing on the other corner. So this piece will come over here. This will be all pressed and tidy and nice. This piece will come over here. You'll sew on that marked diagonal, press away, make sure everything is tidy around the outside edge, trim out those bottom 2 layers, and then you're going to press that seam open as well. You are going to need a total of 4 of these units. Okay, I have my unit 1 pieces, 4 of them right here. That's what they look like pressed open. And then my pinwheel is right here. I want to talk about the pressing just a little bit here on this pinwheel. Now you're going to see that it tells you to press in one direction, which is great. But with pinwheel blocks, you can always take things one step further than the information most patterns will give you. And you can do something called spinning your seams. And that is going to lay this center just a little bit flatter. Let me show you what that would look like if you did that. So right now I have it pressed. You're going to see that the vertical seams, one seam is left, one seam goes right. Whereas this one, everything is running the whole way across in one direction. What we can do is we can just adjust this a little bit. If you push this top seam up, there might be a stitch or 2 that you'd have to take out right here in the center to get that seam to go up. And then press that in place. When you see that little pinwheel in the center of your block, you know you've got it sorted just right. You can press that in place, and then that makes this lay just a little bit flatter when you take that additional step of spinning your seams. I am sure that there are YouTube tutorials specifically on spinning your seams if you want to get a better detailed approach to exactly what that looks like, but it's not a hard step to take, just an extra step to take that will allow that seam to lay nice and flat. So when I go back up to my sewing room to sew up the next couple units, I'm going to press this and show you how nice that lays when we come back down here again. So let's set this to the side so I remember to take that extra step, and then we are going to move on to, let's see, we're ready for step number 5. We are making more stitch and flip units, the same technique like what we just did. So I'm not going to go in detail about the technique itself, but just explain to you the pieces that we need. You're going to be using B, and then you are going to use G for your left corner, and you are going to use C, this is your print 2C, for the right side. Again, you have marked diagonals on the back of these 2 squares here, and you're going to pay attention to the direction G runs and the direction that C runs, those marked diagonals. So you'll do, let me separate this here. You'll do the left side first, noticing that this is running differently than what it did up above. Once you've completed the left side, then you will add C on to the right side. You're going to press those seams open as well, and you're going to make 4 of them. Here is what this pinwheel looks like now pressed. You can see that that just lays so nicely. And this is a great step to take to get your seams, your center there to lay nice and flat. This is also a step that I myself don't take that often. So even though it's something that works great, looks great, I am very guilty of not taking that final step. So, but it's good to know that you can do that if you want to. All right, tuck that to the side. Our next step here is to sew together our 1 and 2, unit 1 and unit 2, like this. You're going to sew these together. You see this happening in step 6. And again, as you work your way through the pattern, all of these spots where you can't see what it says, though, that's where it's telling you the measurements each step of the way. So you can always double check every step, make sure that your sewing is accurate and that everything is what it should be measuring. So I'm going to go sew all of these together. You're going to make 4 units just like this. These units, all 4 of them, are all pressed and ready to go. That's what the back looks like. And now we are ready to sew these pieces into our completed block. So let's go ahead and get these laid out. You're going to use your D squares. And then these guys here. You're going to use them like this. Pinwheel goes in the center. Well, let's straighten you up. There you go. And then your D squares. And there we go. And then all we need to do is sew together our horizontal rows. We're going to press as illustrated. After you complete those rows, you're going to sew everything together and press as shown, and your block will be complete. And here is our completed Star Twist block. I love the way this looks in those Callie & Co. blues. I think the blues in Callie & Co. are so pretty. Now, these fabrics should be in quilt shops this month, later this month, maybe into the first part of December. We never know exactly when things are going to arrive into shops, but very soon, Callie & Co. will be available to purchase. And of course, Coriander Seeds is a basic, so those are available in quilt shops all the time. But I thought this was so pretty in these blues. There's the pressing on the back. And that's what it takes to make one Star Twist block. So if you've been on the fence about this pattern, thinking maybe it was a little too tricky, or just wondering in general what the construction technique would be, that's what you're going to be looking at to make one of these blocks. So the pattern is linked below should you find yourself interested in making a $5 purchase today or anytime through November. It will be for sale in my Etsy shop. Okay. Let's move on to the next thing. A couple weeks ago, I asked your help for choosing my border fabric color on my Cupcake mini quilt. I had shared a tutorial on using those Cupcake papers, made the little mini quilt, and knew that I wanted to make a larger quilt. I was looking for a quilt that measures about 48 by 60 because that's such a nice donation size for some of the spots I donate to, and so was planning on adding wide borders to the sides of the quilt. I'll link to the videos where I've chatted about this quilt previously, so if you're wondering what in the world I'm talking about, you can find the information. But if you were one of the ones that voted, the color that overwhelmingly won was red. You guys wanted a red border, so I have added a wide red border to the top, bottom, and sides of my Cupcake mini quilt, and I think that turned out so pretty. That adds just such a beautiful frame. I think there's enough white in the mini that it looks great with just that red border. I knew I only wanted to add one border. I wasn't interested in adding multiple borders, and I think that turned out really pretty. So here we go. This is what we're looking at. And then I'm going to talk about these borders just a little bit too, because this is the quilt I was talking about where I said I added a wider top and bottom than I did at the sides. So we've got a pretty wide top border here, and you can see, so this is the width of the top, and then the width of the side is shorter. And this is what it looks like. It just frames that out so pretty. Makes a nice big quilt without, well, not terribly big. It's a throw size quilt, but it's much bigger than what we started with. So it really adds some size to what would otherwise have been a mini quilt. So there she is. So this print is Beautiful Day, one of my fabric lines, and the center prints are from a Camille Roskeli line, and the white backgrounds are all from Coriander Seeds. And that's what it turned out. So now it just needs to be sent off to the quilter. I think I am probably going to find a really pretty rose motif for that quilting. I think that should complement it beautifully. I'm thinking white minky on the back. As you know, I love minky for my backings on these donation quilts. I wanted to mention another thing about these wide borders. It's not something maybe you consider. I think we're more apt to add multiple borders rather than one single wide border. But another time when I think a wide border is especially effective is on something like a barn star quilt. So maybe you want a star in the center of your bed and you found the perfect star pattern, but it's small, wall hanging sized. Now you can take my barn star, something like this. These are 40-inch square. Border this out with a super wide border, something kind of neutral. And then just let the star be the star because then it centers that motif on your bed so nicely, and you have a large quilt. You know, even if it's a queen size quilt, it looks beautiful. You have a star in the center. You've got all this beautiful white space on the top and bottom, or dark. I know not all of you like using white borders, white backgrounds. Use something dark, but you've got all of this negative space then around the perimeter of your star, which is right, you know, nicely on your bed. And you can show off some really beautiful quilting on those borders. So that's another way where I think wide borders can be especially effective in quilt making. Well, I have enjoyed sharing all of the things here with you today. Be sure to stop by my blog for those recolorings of the Star Twist quilt. Again, the pattern is $5 over on Etsy. If you have any questions about anything we've chatted about today, feel free to let me know. And I look forward to chatting with you more in the comments and chatting again with you next Saturday.